Well, hello, friends, and welcome. My name is Stephen Fetter. I manage the United Learning Program for the General Counsel Office. And once again, it's a delight and a privilege to be able to welcome you from coast to coast and beyond into this program about sorting out our place in colonialism. We are delighted to welcome Elaine and Ched back, and we're looking forward to another really exciting and provocative evening. Thank you for joining us. Once again, I wanted to remind you that your way to communicate with us is through the chat. I'm actually going to disable the microphones for everybody except the speakers so that we don't inadvertently interrupt each other with dog barking and all those sorts of exciting things. Sarah Stratton is here beside me. She has a cat who likes to turn the microphone on off, whose name fortuitously is Steve. So Steve is going to be an interrupter, whichever Steve is here. But the rest of you can use the chat if you please. And once again, I'll watch the chat so that if things are flying too quickly for Elaine or Ched or Sarah to notice, I'm here in the background to offer some backup. But really, that's my job, and I'm going to otherwise get out of the way and turn things over to Sarah to open our meeting. Sarah, over to you.
Great, thanks, Steve. Now I just see you as a big black and white cat. Sorry, but I'll try and get that image out of my head. I'm going to be much more hands off tonight than I was last week. I'll just be like the rest of you, listening to Elaine and Ched and thinking about what they have to say about their book. But I am gonna open us in a reflection again from late Richard Wagamese, and I'll come back near the end of the session to set us up for what's coming next. But if we could just settle our minds and our hearts after busy days, or in the midst of busy days, we're in many time zones, and listen to these words about relationship from, as I said, Ojibwe writer late Richard Wagamese. From our very first breath, we are in relationship. With that indrawn draft of air, we become joined to everything that ever was, is, and ever will be. When we exhale, we forge that relationship by virtue of the act of living. Our breath commingles with all breath, and we are a part of everything. That's the simple fact of things. We are born into a state of relationship, and our ceremonies and rituals are guides to lead us deeper into that relationship with all things. Big lesson: relationships never end. They just change. In believing that lies the freedom to carry compassion, empathy, love, kindness, and respect into and through whatever changes. We are made more by that practice. With thanks for that wisdom, I will turn to Elaine and Ched for their wisdom for the next 40 minutes or so, I think, is what we had settled on. So, friends, take it over.
Hi, friends. We're just making sure our tech is working here. We are hoping you can see an opening slide. Sarah, can you give us thumbs up if you see?
That's good. Yep.
All right. Thanks so much. It is delightful to see so many of you joining us, and happy May Day to everyone. As a small binational organization, we are happy whenever we get a chance to work with the United Church's reconciliation and Indigenous justice and anti-racism colleagues. So thank you again for this invitation. Thanks for this opportunity to talk together about our book, about decolonization and reparations strategies. We wanted you all to see where we are beaming in from, the little town of Oakview, where Sarah Stratton has visited us more than a decade ago at our Bartimaeus Institute. We are halfway up the Ventura River watershed in the Southern California bioregion. And that is if you've had a chance to look at Healing Haunted Histories, that is the second context for the analysis that we focus on. Where we live is the heart of traditional, unceded, and untreated Chumash territory, a community and legacy to which we as resettlers here are responsible. Because of the incredible rains this year, 4 inches alone in our little watershed, native wildflowers are exploding this spring, and actually the super bloom is visible from space in satellite photos. And this picture here, these are California golden poppies, which is our state flower that are just busting forth and partying in our yard. Our task in this second session, in this series being curated by Adele and Tony and Sarah, is to highlight just a few key themes of this volume. And then we're going to open it up for discussion. So please feel free to type your questions and comments into the chat as we go along. And as we said last week, this book is primarily addressed to settlers of European descent, embracing that particular anti-racist strategy of white folks doing our own work together. But all of us have been shaped and misshaped by white supremacist settler colonialism. So we invite migrants and settlers of other ethnicities and genealogies, including those whose ancestors were brought to North America forcibly, newer immigrants and Indigenous people to feel free to adapt this approach to their context and needs if they find it helpful. And we'll say more about that in a moment. Because we are all inheritors of haunted history, and all of us on this Zoom tonight are seeking justice and healing. Here are the pieces of this rather long project that we will overview tonight. We'll start by reflecting briefly on the contested semantics of reconciliation, since it is still very much in use in our churches. Then we'll unpack the notion of hauntings as a way of encountering the dis-ease among and within us all under settler colonialism. Next, we'll briefly introduce the landlines, bloodlines, and songlines model as the framework through which we invite folks to investigate and engage the history and continuing culture of colonization in which we are all implicated in and or impacted by. And then we will close by focusing on a few examples of personal and political reparations, the kind of healing practices we believe are constitutive to a discipleship of restorative solidarity. Over the last 30 years, the seminal TRC experiments in South Africa, Greensboro, North Carolina, Canada, and the state of Maine have inspired both public discussions and local initiatives to try to address longstanding issues of white, Black, and settler Indigenous historic violations and current disparities throughout North America. But discourses of reconciliation are often problematic, especially in our religious circles. We acknowledge in the book that notions of reconciliation are too often filtered through settler sentimentality, which presumes to resolve centuries of oppression with ritual apologies. But settler colonialism is a structure requiring systemic transformation, and so rhetorical contrition is hardly sufficient. The desire of a complicit group for reconciliation without cost or radical change is little more than another example of what Unangak's scholar Eve Tuck calls a settler move to innocence. So it is hardly surprising that such semantics and politics of reconciliation are rejected as disingenuous by both Indigenous and Black activists. And this is, of course, increasingly the case in Canada in the wake of years of political and institutional ambivalence about implementing the TRC's 2015 concrete calls to action, including 9 directed to faith communities. And unfortunately, our churches are often responsible for injecting cheapening notions of grace into public conversations that seek to reckon with historical violations. And obviously here we are alluding to the great Dietrich Bonhoeffer's critique of cheap grace. He reminds us that the implicated cannot set the terms of forgiveness, and that our apologies are empty without real steps toward repentance, which is to say, turning our personal and political histories around. And this is why we subtitled our book, A Settler Discipleship of Decolonization.
Here's a recent tweet by an evangelical luminary, and it reflects the Christian right's strategy of demonizing woke culture, which is so strong in the US, but I think also present in Canada. So Mr. Tom Buck insists that churches are called to reconciliation, not reparations, revealing that Pastor Buck understands neither restorative justice nor New Testament Greek. We believe that our churches have resources to correct the drift in reconciliation discourse toward instant self-exoneration if we look for help from the scriptural roots of our tradition. In the first volume of our 2009 Ambassadors of Reconciliation project, we explore at length Paul's argument in 2 Corinthians 5 and 6, where the apostle asserts that reconciliation is indeed our core vocation as Christians, but his vocabulary there is all about repairing equity. The semantic field of the verb to reconcile, Greek katalasso, only used by Paul in the New Testament, is economic, not expiatory. In Aristotle, for example, it connotes an exchange of money to establish equivalence of value. We still speak of reconciling a bank statement. This economic discourse of reconciliation resonates with Hebrew Bible's tradition of Sabbath and Jubilee. The vision of 7th and 49th year release from debt bondage is precisely the meaning of the divine decision not to count our trespasses against us in 2 Corinthians 5:19. Christ heralds the renewal of the divine economy of grace. The old debt system is passing away. To reconcile, then, is to restore balance and equity among peoples. And we contend that this vision of reconciliation is far from dead. It is, however, difficult and demanding work. As a great TRC chairperson, Judge Marie Sinclair, put it, reconciliation is not a walk in the park, but a steep ascent up a mountain. Indigenous peoples have shown us the way, but it is up to us settlers to do the climbing. And that, we think, represents a poignant and compelling call to our churches to embrace a discipleship of decolonization.
Since we work binationally, we want to invoke another contemporary prophet, the young Amanda Gorman, who offered profound poetic reflections about repair at the inauguration of President Biden in January 2021. Poignantly, her comments came just 2 weeks after the pro-Trump riot at the US Capitol. These two moments, on January 6th, white supremacists calling for insurrection while parading the Confederate flag through the Capitol Rotunda for the first time in US history, and on January 20th, a descendant of enslaved peoples remembering the pain of American apartheid and holding the country to account. These two represent the two primary trajectories contesting for our hearts and minds at this point in history in the US. Ms. Gordon called Americans to move beyond our presumptions of innocence and inherited pride in order to step into our history so we can repair it. And then she warned us, while we have our eyes on the future, she said, history has its eyes on us. We think her words apply to Canadian history as well. But how exactly does history have its eyes on us? Sociologist Avery Gordon, in her important 1997 book, Ghostly Matters, argues, haunting is a constituent element of modern social life through which repressed or unresolved social violence makes itself known in everyday life, especially when they're supposedly over and done with, slavery, for instance, or when their oppressive nature is continuously denied. Importantly, Gordon also emphasizes how reckoning with these ghosts can mobilize individual, social, or political movements and change, but only if they're faced. In the same vein, Unangak scholar Eve Tuck names settler colonialism, which she defines succinctly as the management of those who have been made killable. It is the oldest, she names it as the oldest and longest haunted history in North America. And indeed, a half millennium of colonization has left a legacy of violation and genocide that inhabits every intersection of settler and Indigenous worlds, past and present, which is also deeply woven into the fabric of our personal and political lives. Unless and until this legacy is faced and healed, Tuck asserts, there will always be more ghosts to return. The ghosts that Gordon and Tuck are talking about dramatically arose, as you well know, in the summer of 2021, the uncoveries by Canada's First Nations of unmarked children's graves at IRS sites. These revelations literally represent a haunting, forcing Canadians to confront anew the colonial settler policy of forced assimilation of Indigenous peoples by removing children from their home into mostly church-run residential schools, where widespread abuse seeded another round of intergenerational trauma among survivors. The grim unearthings of these hauntings indeed animated protests, and ghosts cried out through small red handprints and the lament, "We were children," scrawled on the front doors of the Catholic Cathedral in Saskatoon, my hometown, and kids' shoes and toys placed on the steps. Of course, the same drama will play out in the United States, which also ran boarding schools administered by churches, as Interior Secretary Deb Haaland of Laguna Pueblo leads a similar search for unmarked graves at boarding school sites here. But here's another kind of haunting. A few years ago, we discovered this graffiti scrawled against a fence in a backyard alley just a block from where I grew up in suburban Saskatoon, and you will recognize this venerable phrase: as long as the sun shines, grass grows, and the rivers flow. It comes from the two-row wampum of 1613, one of the first agreements made between Indigenous peoples and representatives of a colonial government on Turtle Island, and it is reiterated in most subsequent agreements in Canada. Former Saskatchewan Office of the Treaty Commissioner Director Harry Lafon taught us that Cree elders use the term Kichi Asotomatoen to describe sacred promises made to one another in treaty. Yet, all over North America, the settler state broke such promises. The fact is, our landscapes throughout Turtle Island are tattooed by such unsettling hauntings, which continually problematize our unresolved history, right up to the present moment.
Last month, some of us in the US commemorated the 55th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., our greatest national prophet. And King understood haunted histories. 60 years ago, his book, Why We Can't Wait, published on the centenary of the Emancipation Proclamation, articulated the origins of our colonial dis-ease. We found this passage to be such a profound diagnosis that we use it as an opening focalizer of our book. And again, we think it speaks to the Canadian reality as well. Our nation was born in genocide, King begins. For too long, the depth of racism in American life has been underestimated. King likened it to a lethal cancer in need of surgery. But this intervention, he cautioned, would be complex and detailed, requiring the use of powerful methods to look through the facades of white settler excuses for and denials of our history in order to reveal, quote, the full extent of the disease. We may resonate with King's call to liberate ourselves from this tangled web of prejudice, but we always underestimate how deeply it has been woven into our consciousness.
Our Healing Haunted Histories project is one attempt to follow the calls to discipleship given by Judge Sinclair, Poet Gordon, and Prophet King. We offer a framework for examining the deepest layers of hauntings and injustices in our colonial societies. The aim of this book is to encourage, challenge, and capacitate settler Christians and other people of faith and conscience to understand how our histories, landscapes, and communities are haunted by the long and continuing history of Indigenous dispossession wrought by settler colonialism. To transform our self-understandings, lifeways, and structures that we inhabit, and to practice restorative solidarity with Indigenous communities as part of the wider movement of decolonization. As early disciples of the Apostle Paul put it in Ephesians 5, we are called by Christ to awaken from our sleep in order to engage the hard work of exposing long-standing and shameful works of darkness and bringing them into the light of justice and healing. The biggest barrier to this gospel vocation, however, is the sleep of denial that characterizes dominant culture. For centuries, settler colonialism has disappeared or repressed voices that contradicted our self-congratulatory narratives. And our communal stories, media, and educational systems have followed suit. So we settlers have been socialized to avoid personal and political responsibility regarding both public history and our own family stories. Our insistence upon our innocence prevents us from embracing Dr. King's call to X-ray our history in order to heal our hauntings. Here are two typical strategies of the many that we explore in our book. One is what Canadian scholars Vimalasuri, Peages, and Goldstein call colonial agnosia. So this is not collective amnesia, but is a collective act of ignoring, which is reinforced through our educational systems and media. We just think colonization is just too difficult to understand. We don't know, and we do not want to know. Not about the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, not about Wounded Knee in 1890, not about Standing Rock in 2017, and not about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. A second strategy is to aggressively dissociate ourselves from a past which is, quote, not our fault, and to be dismissive of those who seek to face and heal it. Here we embrace an ahistorical individualism, understanding ourselves as free-floating entities, untethered and unaccountable. This has been called a transcendent denial, which makes us, quote, sick at heart and soul, unable to look at each other or ourselves without weariness.
Because of this culture of denial, the task of reckoning with historic and continuing wounds is, for most of our settler churches, an overwhelming proposition. Recognizing this sense of disconnection, our approach aims to persuade regular people that every one of us is both object and subject of settler colonial systems and their legacy. They are not something apart from our everyday lives, nor are they someone else's problem. So we invite a critical tracing of our own family and communal histories in order to understand how we carry the wounds of the violence and dispossession of colonization, what King called the full extent of the disease. Sometimes our ancestors were victims, sometimes perpetrators, no matter how unwillingly, sometimes both. Unwittingly, right? But the toxic river of colonization runs through each and every one of us. We can't escape this disease, we can only deny it. Conversely, only engaging our implication and impacts by this history will motivate us to the healing that justice brings. So we start where the personal and political intersect, an exploration of our family storylines, tracing and analyzing place, people, and spirit to name and heal hauntings. Landlines, mapping past and present geographies of inhabitation to understand how we are shaped by and shapers of those places for good and for ill. Bloodlines, mapping family and community genealogies, including race and ethnicity, class, assimilation, and erasure, and the trauma and entanglement we carry in our bones. And songlines, remembering liberative traditions of faith, conscience, and solidarity that continue to inspire practices of justice and compassion among our people. So we invite our readers to explore and interrogate and decolonize each of these strands. As our working example, we focus on Elaine's Mennonite settler storylines, and that's the kind of backbone narrative of our book. We want to take a moment here to review briefly one of the broad analytical models we posit in the book, in light of the discussion last week about the semantics of who and what the term settler might connote in the framework of settler colonialism. Admittedly, the term settler, as a generalization, obscures many complexities. At the same time, it is a practical impossibility to talk about complicated realities without using some degree of generalizing parlance in everyday life. For example, we use the terms Canadian or American or modern or working people or Christian for that matter. But here we qualify the term settler by acknowledging 4 categories of volition in the historic and contemporary movement of peoples, differentiated along a spectrum of agency from highest to lowest.
So in this typology, a colonist represents the vanguard populations of a political project by a colonizing power, intent on occupying and expropriating land and resources. It includes economic or military agents of conquest and initial settlement. So, for example, that is explorers, militia, traders, resource extractors, government officials, and workers under contract, etc. And in some cases, missionaries and their institutions. Let's keep in mind that this applies as much to modern international corporate agents, pressing Canadian mining interests abroad, for example, as it does to conquistadors of old. Now, an opportunist's migration involves some degree of settler political and/or economic mobility, privilege, and/or agency. So this sometimes includes official subsidies or incentives to move from, quote, old country to new, example, free land, quote, or transportation. Opportunists migrate for land, work, including today professional deployment and education, family reunification, and even adventure. The third broad category is distressed immigrants, those who are pushed and pulled by forces beyond their control, usually economic or political, but sometimes environmental, for example, flood or famine. And of course, today we need to name climate change. They are pushed to leave home for somewhere else in order to survive, improve viability, attain religious, political, or cultural freedoms, and or reunite with family. And the fourth is forced relocation. This is when political or economic forces kidnap, traffic, or otherwise drive people across borders through war, ethnic cleansing, and slavery. And this also includes Indigenous peoples who are dispossessed by the settler state. Many people with racial and or economic privilege today have ancestral immigration stories characterized by the first two types, whereas the latter two remain the reality of all poor refugees or dislocatees. Now, our primary purpose in proposing these categories is to help people think about the social and political factors influencing their ancestors and their own migrations, including our resettlements. Analytical frameworks like this are obviously generalizing, thus requiring considerable nuancing, but they can help us delve more deeply and critically into the history that each of us carries. Naming diversities of volition pushes against simple stories and helps us learn about different experiences and forces that brought people to Turtle Island, and then once here, that continued to move us around. Now, in real life, of course, our stories reflect many shades of gray and overlapping of categories. For example, voluntary migrants of color often lose class status upon arriving in a white supremacist culture and are forced to take marginalizing work because of racial ethnic discrimination, thus becoming what we might call a distressed settler. A contrasting example is a distressed immigrant who is able to take advantage of white or white passing opportunities and is thus able to move into positions of privilege within a generation or two. So if you read the book, you learn that my grandparents' migration reflected the third type, while my move from Canada to the US almost 35 years ago was as an opportunist. So we really invite you to think about how political opportunity or oppression moved you or your ancestors around the globe and or here on Turtle Island. How does this story reflect larger socio-political patterns on one hand, but on the other hand, also shades of gray and contradictions? And so with that, we want to ask Steve. Sorry. We want to ask Steve to launch our first poll. Now, in this first poll, we're asking 6 yes or no questions. And please fill it out as quickly as you are able. And then we'll ask Steve to show the results in the aggregate. So the poll is anonymous, and your individual answers or names will not be shown, and it will all come back just as a total yes or no for each question. So please take a few minutes. I hope the poll, oh, we're already starting. Thanks, friends. Take a few minutes and let's fill out this poll.
Elaine, how do we answer number 2 or do we not answer it if our grandmother only spoke English?
Yeah, don't answer it.
Okay.
Yeah. I should say that nobody who is listed as a co-host can
answer.
fill out the poll. So that's Sarah and Jamie and Elaine and Ched and me. We don't have the option because we are supposed to be monitoring and managing rather than participating. So that's a Zoom thing and we have no control over that.
Man, sorry, Sarah.
I'm just so deeply disappointed, but
Sarah, I could demote you to participant if you really want to vote.
no, I'm fine.
Now, Steve, oh, okay, so you can scroll down. Friends, I'm sure you are better at Zoom than I am. You can scroll down on the poll to make sure you get to all 6 questions.
That's important because it won't allow you to submit any of your answers until you've answered all 6 questions.
Okay, then question number 2. You have to hit, do you know the language that she spoke if other than English? If it is English, then you hit no. Sorry about that. Thank you, friends. You are doing great already at, whoa. Yes, we're flying along. 65 of you have participated. Thank you. That's wonderful.
So we'll give you another 15 seconds or so. We have about 90% of folks, 80% of folks have responded. Yeah. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, let's call it there, Elaine and Ched.
Yes, that is
We'll
really wonderful.
share the results so that people can see where they stand.
Wow. Now, have you shared the results? Sorry, Steve, I'm a little.
Yes, the people can see them now.
Okay, wonderful. You know, actually, this is really quite amazing to me, that 41% of us know our grandmother's name, because this question asks us to stretch 4 generations back. And this means this crowd that is gathered here today knows a lot more about their history or their familial history than a lot of the groups that we have worked with in our past. You know, when we don't, so many of us are not able, sometimes even to name our great-grandparents, let alone our great-great-grandparents, because of the dissipating and fracturing, how fractured American life, Canadian life has been. And again, people have been pushed and pulled around the landscapes by these great forces of economic and political policies, and have lost their familial stories because they have been deemed uninteresting or unimportant. And this question of knowing the name of your grandmother's grandmother is an indication of that. And again, I am surprised by the 41%. Now, do you know the language, tongue she spoke, if other than English? And again, it is, and maybe Canadians are different at this, 45% is that's a very high percentage, because language is one of the first things that we lose when we migrate to a new country and to a new culture. And of course, you all are very aware that there is great effort in many Indigenous communities to recover or retain their languages. Assimilation similarly disappears our familial and communal cultures and forces us into conformity with the dominant white English-speaking culture. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, thank you. Chad is reminding me to make sure to include question 3 here. Yeah, and here it is much lower, that 23% are still only speaking it. Yeah, and this, I think, too, is reflective. Number 4, only 16% of us, of our ancestors, came as involuntary migrants, where 84% of us came voluntarily. And this reflects probably the higher percentage of European descendants here. And this is one of the things that we push in the book of how we as descendants of European settlers begin to understand the stories of our getting a little feedback there, our migrant ancestors. Oh, look at that. Your turn. Wow, 50% even. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is the question about mobility and resettling, and very significant that it's about half and half of folks who still generally live in the bioregion in which they were born, and those who have moved around, and not moved around just once, but moved around multiple times. That, of course, is a reflection of the cultural, political, and economic forces of capitalism in which folks are chasing jobs, money, opportunity, and so on. Question 6 is about what we call song lines, how we draw spiritual traditions and practices from ancestors. And, you know, in this group, being a largely churched group, we assume it's a much higher answer than oftentimes we would find in the culture in general. And the way in which, you know, the church, for all of its flaws, is a vehicle for the transmission of spiritual and sacred traditions. Those institutions and those transmissions, however, are often disrupted by mobility, by forces of assimilation, and forces of conformity. So that's where the church can and frankly should be a community of resistance in which spirituality is being retained with a degree of continuity. And I think that's, is that our first 6 questions poll? So we're just getting a little bit of a sketch of who we are. These are the kinds of interesting questions that we aim to get into in this book, and that you'll be getting into in the next session. Thank you, Steve. So landlines, bloodlines, and songlines work offers a way for regular folk and institutions to grapple with issues which we typically perceive as too big, too abstract, or too removed from our influence or agency. The fact is, regardless of our different bloodlines of race and class, all non-Indigenous North Americans inhabit land that was stolen. And we are all complicit, which is to say, entangled in the historical legacy of white supremacist institutions and policies, and in the ongoing afterlife of settler colonialism that inhabits inside us and surrounds us. Michael Rothberg's important 2019 book puts it this way: when it comes to historical violence and contemporary inequality, none of us are completely innocent. We may not be direct agents of harm, but we may inhabit or benefit from regimes of domination that we neither set up nor control. Rothberg argues that the familiar categories of victim, perpetrator, and bystander don't quite adequately account for our connection to injustices past and present. And he's offered a new broad theory of political responsibility through the figure of what he calls the implicated subject. Indigenous activist Nikki Sanchez puts the whole matter far more succinctly. The history of settler colonialism is not your fault, she says, but it is absolutely your responsibility.
Awakening to our responsibility requires a journey deep into the layers of our personal and political captivity and conformity. In order to nurture the courage to feel the pain of our entanglement in racism and colonization, past and present, and to heal, we must pursue an archaeology of self and society. We white folks need to recognize the emotional labor of Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks. It is too costly for them to have to share their pain so we can understand the issues. Our work cannot be sustained on other people's pain, nor on their strength. This is what the great writer activist Audre Lorde called doing our own work. A discipleship of decolonization invites us to reread our people's stories mindfully, critically, and compassionately, including our own biographies, with a commitment to restorative solidarity. Resisting on one hand the temptation to paralyzing shaming and blaming, but on the other hand, to self-exoneration. And we use the metaphor of peeling an onion with all its accompanying tears. And we long for our faith communities to be places where we settlers can nurture the courage to face and engage the many layers of hauntings and find both healing and justice, to which the gospel calls us and for which the Spirit empowers us. Parenthetically, Landlines, Bloodlines, and Songlines work can also include a parallel process of examining the genealogies and geographies of our institutions, such as our congregations and seminaries and denominations. And for example, over the past year, I've been part of the Indigenous Studies Committee at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary near Chicago, working to map its storylines regarding colonization. So we are looking at the pre-contact history and ecology of the immediate region, the arrival of settlers, treaties, land secessions, and forced migration of Indigenous peoples, the role of founder Augustus Garrett, how he gained his land and wealth, Garrett's institutional culture and how colonization was legitimated and reproduced theologically, including entanglement with the city powers of Evanston, which is named after John Evans, who, as governor of Colorado Territory in the 1860s, bore responsibility for one of the worst massacres of Indigenous peoples in US history at Sand Creek. So the committee is also remembering songlines, such as how Garrett was engaged with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, the powerful 2014 Acts of Repentance listening sessions among Methodists, and then other prompts that led to the work of this Indigenous Studies Committee. But we have noticed, Ched and I, in workshopping this material for several years now, that settlers often our energy rises while we are examining our family histories, but falls when it's time to talk about concrete changes going forward. Again, we cite Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang's work, reminding us that decolonization is not a metaphor. It must ultimately lead toward restorative land justice. So the goal of our Healing Haunted Histories process is to animate concrete expressions of redistributive justice, which brings us to the last segment of this brief overview.
In Ambassadors of Reconciliation, Volume 2, we explored how principles of restorative justice might be applied to historic injustices. In our new book, we build this out, looking at the process of settler restorative solidarity as three interrelated commitments. One, to do our own work around issues like agnosia and dissociation, white fragility, ethnic loss and assimilation, the impact of intergenerational trauma and moral injury, in order to understand our own deformation by and entanglement in the legacy and structures of settler colonialism. Secondly, to listen to how Indigenous and other communities injured by historic and current injustices are identifying harms, needs, and responsibilities. And third, to work with these communities to make things as right as possible, including covenants of accountability, restitution, reparations, repatriation, and perhaps, over time, genuine reconciliation based on equity. This process, of course, is an ongoing circle. It is, in fact, a life work. which requires an intergenerational movement, which are precisely the commitment arcs that are also supposed to characterize us as church. In turn, we explore 4 aspects of the work of restorative solidarity. 1, reschooling, regarding our colonial legacy and identity, building literacy, critical analysis, and imagination. Relationship building with Indigenous communities, especially our neighbors. Restorative actions that support work for Indigenous justice, and reparative experiments with resources we individually or collectively own, control, or influence. So we want to just give a few brief examples of each aspect. Our annual week-long Bartimaeus Institutes seek to create a space for reschooling ourselves, offering instruction, inspiration, and empowerment that engages not only our heads, but also our hearts, hands, and spirit. We focus on critical immersion in the landlines, bloodlines, and songlines of our faith traditions, especially scripture, of exemplary social movements, historical and contemporary, and of our own lives.
Here we gather with kindred spirits to do serious work at the intersection of sanctuary, seminary, streets, and soil. And we even held an institute in Saskatoon in 2016, focused on the TRC's calls to action for churches. And some of you on this call helped and were a part of that. Curating such spaces is crucial so that we white settler Christians and others can deepen our journeys from denial to discipleship of healing hauntings. And we urge you to participate in the many programs the United Church holds on anti-racism work, because these spaces motivate and equip all of us to engage more deeply in the next 3 aspects of restorative solidarity.
Cree elder and Catholic deacon Harry LaFond from Muskeg Lake Nation in Saskatchewan emphasizes that relationship is essential to solidarity. Harry and his partner Jermaine are well known around Saskatchewan for their efforts to build intercultural competence. We've been privileged to collaborate with them for almost a decade now, and this summer we're excited to take a retreat with them, participate in the Muskeg Lake Powwow, and join one of the first Catholic pilgrimages to incorporate a pipe ceremony. Here at home, we've built relationships with Chumash leaders such as Elder Julie Tumamite and linguist Matt Vestudo. So it's crucial for all of us to build strong relationships with local tribal leaders as we move into decolonization as a way of life, so that our actions are not being done to or for, but with Native communities.
Third, it's essential that as we learn to listen to Indigenous concerns, we show up in meaningful ways to support, accompany, and stand with communities engaged in righting historical wrongs. For example, some of our young faith-rooted activists have joined the annual Women and Water Coming Together Symposium held at La Courte Oriel's Reservation in northern Wisconsin to learn from Indigenous elders about the importance of healing ourselves and the earth. Supporting the ongoing missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls movement is crucial. And in both Canada and the US, resource extraction is one fraught area of contestation, from Standing Rock to Wet'suwet'en. Faith leaders have been active in demonstrations around pipeline justice, such as in nonviolent actions at the Kinder Morgan facility at Burnaby Mountain. The group pictured here, which includes 2 dear friends, Steve Heinrichs, former Director for Indigenous Settler Relations for Mennonite Church Canada, and Anglican priest Laurel Dykstra, were responding to an invitation to religious leaders from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation to oppose the pipeline project. In our book, we tell the story of how the first Mennonites arrived in Saskatchewan in the late 19th century, and how they were given treaty land that the Canadian government confiscated from the young Chipewyan at Okwashimaw-Chikatanaw. The tribe has been landless and federally unrecognized since. After a long struggle to learn about this history, some Mennonites and Lutherans living in this area have joined with the young Chipewyan the effort to address this historic injustice. And we've had the opportunity to participate in trust building, educational and community building events at Abwashamau Chikatanau, as well as at the Spruce River Folk Festival, an annual music and cultural event on a local Mennonite farm, which raises money for the Young Chippewayan land claims effort. But ultimately, our practices of decolonization must lead to reparations and rematriation. Again, keep in mind that of the total landmass of both Canada and the United States, Indigenous reserves and reservations constitute only 0.2%.
The gospel story of Jesus and the rich man makes it clear that returning that which has been stolen is a precondition for the discipleship of the affluent and the implicated, and for our healing. We know that talk of reparations spikes our settler anxieties, and that our communities and institutions typically dismiss it as too complicated or unrealistic. But we Christians can and must think and organize together with Indigenous colleagues concerning power, money, and land justice. Here are just a few personal, ecclesial, and political examples. A few years ago, the youth group at Emmanuel United Church congregation in Waterloo donated $2,000 to the White Owl Native Ancestry Association, and the two groups got to talking. In 2017, the church donated land back to White Owl. Florence Schloniger is a Mennonite pastor and descendant of immigrants who settled Kansa land in the late 1870s. By 1846, 20 million acres of Kansa territory had been reduced to 250,000, and in 1873, the tribe was forcibly removed to Oklahoma. Learning that history, Florence gave $10,000, a portion of her share of her family's homestead sale, to the Kansa Indigenous Heritage Society. This new organization works to maintain the legacy and memory of the people for whom Kansas is named, and to provide settlers avenues to make things right.
Close to us, a small but significant land back project has just begun in Los Angeles, involving a Jewish landowner who gave an acre of land back to a local Tongva group. This is the first land back project in this metropolis. We visited the site recently with an interfaith delegation and worked closely with one of its animators. This is a modest initiative, but it is adjacent to a very prominent park and neighborhood, and so is very visible. It's even more powerful, however, when institutions decide to make reparations, as these can have wider impact on other organizations. Today, as you know, many mainstream denominations face dwindling congregations and underused church buildings, and some parishes are closing their doors. Stony Point Presbyterian Church in New York made the difficult decision in fall 2017, but it led to a concrete gesture of repatriation. In 2016, the Presbyterian Church USA General Assembly repudiated the doctrine of discovery, and the General Assembly called on all levels of PCUSA to enter into dialogue, strategy, and action with Indigenous people of the region as part of a process of confession and repentance to redress wrongs. Rickover Chase, former denominational moderator, proposed to Stony Point Pres that they explore with local Indigenous leaders a possible handover of the property. Discussions with Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapo Lenape Nation culminated in November 2019 handover of the former Stony Point Church and all of its property to the newly created Sweetwater Cultural Center to promote education, health, and welfare of Native peoples and to preserve their cultures and ceremonial practices. Today, Sweetwater is thriving, and we've been honored to collaborate in some of their programming.
In 1819, John Stewart, an enslaved person who had been freed, became the first Methodist missionary to the Wyandot Nation in Ohio. When the Wyandot were forced to Oklahoma under the 1834 Indian Removal Act, they deeded 3 acres of their land to the church to secure it from desecration. The United Methodist denomination held this land in trust until September 2019, the bicentennial of Methodist missions in the U.S., when the parcel, including the original mission building, and a cemetery where tribal members and Stewart are buried was returned to the Wyandot Nation. The ceremony brought together 100 tribal members, the most that had been back on that ancestral land since they were forced to leave.
In the realm of public policy, things get more complicated, at least for our settler political imaginations. Recent grassroots experiments in voluntary taxing as civil society reparations are thus a good place to start. The Sogoreate Land Trust is an urban intertribal organization led by Indigenous women in Ohlone territory in the San Francisco Bay Area. It is working to rematriate urban land to Indigenous stewardship. A priority is to procure land where Ohlone ancestors can be properly reinterred, since every one of the 425 shell mounds, the sacred burial grounds around the bay, have been destroyed by development, while the remains of over 15,000 Ohlone are stored at local universities. Some local settlers, in consultation with Sogoreate, initiated the Shumi land tax. This is a voluntary payment that is both symbolic and substantive. Participants calculate the annual tax based on their rent or mortgage, and then these funds directly support Sogoreate's work to acquire and preserve land, to establish a cemetery to reinter stolen Ohlone ancestral remains, and build urban gardens, community centers, and sacred arbors, so current and future generations of Indigenous peoples can thrive. Their similar symbolic tax initiatives have sprung up in Seattle, New York City, and I'm sure across Canada as well. Let us quickly run the second poll, and then we'll open it up for questions. So, Steve, can you launch that? Okay, friends, you know how to do this. So please participate. Again, these are all yes and no answers.
That's about 94% of people participating. Let's give it another 15 seconds and then we'll close this off.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
Okay, it doesn't look like it's changing anymore. Let me close it and we'll share the results.
Great. Thank you. Wow, again, I have got to say this group has done a lot of their family research in terms of 71% of you knowing the Indigenous tribe of where your immigrant ancestors or you yourself first settled. Again, if we do not know this this information, living on top of land in a state of ambivalence and ignorance. It's just a part, again, of a social agnosia or unknowing that effectively disappears the life and legacy of the Indigenous people that are stewards of this land. And then this agnosia sets the table for wider ambivalence and ignorance of racialized violence right up until the present moment. And again, look at the high amount there.
Mhm. On the other hand, you'll notice the discrepancy between even less conversations about reparation and significant relationships. So knowing something is not yet engaging something, and that's true for all of us. So this is a good straw poll that reminds us that we've got a long way to go to both not just reschool ourselves, but build relationships and have crucial conversations about engagement. I think it's up to him to.
No, it's up to
Okay.
me. Okay, there you go.
So interesting that you're keen on the idea of voluntary tax. We actually don't know of anywhere in Canada where that's happening. There's a number of experiments here, but it may well be happening as well in Canada or other kinds of similar experiments. So that's great that there's a willingness, and this is always something that we can animate, in our own local, even as a congregation. We ourselves are working on that here where we are. So we all have a long way to go. And obviously a lot of support for repatriation, particularly of at least starting with public land. But it may be that those of us who have access to private land need to cajole and shame the government into returning public lands. I think it's very much of a dialectical process. So let's go.
Thank you, Steve. We just have one or two more slides, I think. We're just going to quickly do this. There, right? You go ahead.
So none of the examples that we've talked about are heroic, obviously. Attending demonstrations or modest redistributions of our settler surplus or re-signing the landscape. These are hardly costly to those of us with cultural and political privilege. Still, these kinds of experiments represent beginning steps in a longer journey, which will in turn inspire and equip more substantial efforts. As we said last week, no step is too small and no step is too large. Reparations are about justice, reconciliation as the restoration of equity. But ultimately, it's also about our own healing, even as implicated settlers. But we'll have to get used to working with questions that have no easy answers, some of which came up in last week's conversation. This uncertain terrain tends to be difficult for us managerial-minded settlers to navigate.
But Mohawk educator Tak Alfred sums it up this way. For all of us, Indigenous and settler alike, there is only self-questioning and embracing this commitment. Listen to the voices of our Indigenous ancestors, channeled through the young people of our nations. Learn from Indigenous culture how to walk differently and love the land as best you can. So we've shared some of the ideas we are experimenting with to inspire and capacitate our settler journey of decolonizing discipleship. And so now turn it back over to Sarah to open up our time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ched and Elaine. Lots there to think on and continue having discussions on and see where our at times differing approaches take us into this work. I wanted to just let folks know, it seems like a good opportunity to give a very brief update on some of the reparative justice work that United Churches and the United Church of Canada have been engaged in. And I want to stress that I'm doing it as information sharing, not, as my former colleague, Dallas Fiddler used to say, in a braggy way. He always wanted the church to be honest about the work we had done, but he said, we can't do it in a braggy way. And so that's his advice to me. So I think if you look back at it, particularly around Indigenous issues, if you look back over the last 40 years since the apology, the first apology, well, more than 40 now, you can see acts of reparative justice, which are not the same thing as reparation, right? They're not necessarily they're the approaching an apology, or they're approaching the return of property, or they're the approaching of paying reparation through, for example, the TRC, the funds that we gave there. So there's a number of steps where we can see that, but the conversation has gotten very different in the last 7 to 8 years around what about actual land back. And there has been at least one transfer from Antler River watershed to the Delaware Nation in southwestern Ontario of land. It was a camp that the United Church held, and that was a long process of negotiation, because it's actually very, very difficult to do land back in Canada because of whether reserves are able to hold, whether bands are able to hold land outside of reserve. So that was one act that they did. The Kitchener church that you talked about is another one I'm aware of. There's a church in Queens, in Kingston, Ontario, that has returned land to an Indigenous solidarity group, Indigenous, non-Indigenous group. Camp Mackay in Saskatchewan, Julie Graham has just put is in the chat as well. So there are these examples, and we're looking at more. But I think one of the most significant things that we did as a corporate body was when the caretaker's calls to the church was passed at General Council in 2018, or was accepted rather at General Council in 2018. There is a call there related to reparation and sustainability. And the regional councils immediately got to work on saying, what do we do when we dispose of property when a congregation or a pastoral charge closes? And so now every regional council has guidelines for funds from closed buildings going to the Indigenous church. So that's reparations within an internal structure. So I just wanted to let people know that those things are happening in our context, but there's still much more to do. And in fact, Adele and I are part of a staff team that is looking at the question of reparation, and importantly, not just around Indigenous issues, but also around the Caribbean diaspora and the legacy of enslavement there and what that means. So, and that's, if you follow the news, that's a very lively conversation right now with the CARICOM initiative and responses to it in Britain in particular. So there's lots happening. I understand people want a bio break. So do we want to do like 3 minutes and come back? Is that okay? In other words, pee really quickly.
3 minutes.
Step away and do
Long
that.
sit in front of the screen. I think that's a good
Do that.
idea, Sarah.
Stretch.
Thank you.
Stretch and in the meantime, if you have some questions, I think the easiest way to do them is to put them in the chat. I think, Steve, you probably don't want to be miking and unmiking people.
No, I don't. I've already got a couple in from that I have scooped from the chat, and I'm happy to scoop any more that come in.
Great. And others are putting examples in the chat too, so that's really good to see examples of return of land. It's always, I have to say, as someone who's worked around the churches for 25 years, it's always nice to see people who you've known for 25 years still show up at events. I can see quite a few folks from my old Kairos days, and that's always nice to see. It's always a nice shout out to them.
Welcome
Ah,
back.
our friends back.
It's been 3 minutes, folks, so I think we could probably carry on if you like.
And people will just drop back in as they're able.
Sure.
So Steve, did you want to?
Yeah, Elaine and Ched, your mic is muted, just to let you know. Various different questions that have come in. Some of them have come directly to me, so I rather than sort of focus to everybody in the chat about how do we start doing this, and how do we recognize or deal with the sort of conflicting interests that are going on. I mean, somebody's talking about South Africa, white people leaving South Africa because they didn't feel safe after the changes there. And if that's our model, how do we avoid that kind of thing here? Somebody else talking about the backlash to the indigenous lobster fishery in the East Coast, and how that's kind of put the community at arms against each other. And somebody else just saying, like, how do we begin at the congregational level? My congregation doesn't know where to begin with this. So I think that's a whole constellation of different aspects of the same question. And, feel free to chew on it wherever you like. In the meantime, folks, keep firing the questions in.
Of course, when we look at the patterns of particularly white colonial settlement over hundreds of years, we see the pattern of white folk fortressing themselves, particularly people of privilege, segregating other communities elsewhere. And then when demographics begin to change, you get privileged folk beginning to flee, right? The famous white flight from the 1960s and 70s in our cities. This is some similar kind of concern. Obviously, people who highly privileged people are often highly mobile people, and they will resettle where they feel most insularly safe. But of course, so much of that is fear-driven, and I think part of our redemption, part of our healing, lies in staying with communities, staying in conversation, not fleeing, not living out of fear. And quite frankly, in this work, over and over and over again, we have experienced ourselves and talked to our colleagues who have similarly experienced the tremendous grace that comes from Indigenous communities in the work of decolonization. The deepest, most primal haunting of white consciousness is that folks that we violated, or our ancestors violated, that justice means that there will be retribution. And of course, that's saying a lot about our own haunted history. What we find in reality is that communities are eager to form partnerships, are tremendously gracious, are concerned for the healing of everyone, but will also push persistently for justice. So I think staying with the trouble is a famous phrase now in Canada. I think that's a really good reminder and wisdom to stay in the mess, particularly when it's in points of political flux and economic flux. And I think those who do this deep-rooted self-examination, when we understand our history, we're far less likely to get up and go, because we understand that it's time to stay with the trouble and to face these things. It's folks who have not done any self-examination who are trying to flee and protect their privilege. So that's why we keep stressing how deeply spiritual this work is. And even in the most political of circumstances, working personally on this allows us to hang in there with it.
We just got a lovely personal chat. Thank you for a friend of Harry and Jermaine's. Very nice to meet you online. Sorry, there's no way I can type a response. So thank you for your message. There was a question in this, like, where do we start? And, what if our congregation or the people in our congregation just have no desire to do anything like this? There's a number of fronts we can start on. And one of them that comes to mind is show up. We need to show up at events that Indigenous people are curating, that are obviously open to the public and that they want us to come to. And, if folks in congregations I know are skeptical about doing these things, one of the things that we did last summer at Muskeg Lake was hold, I can't remember who the organizing group was. Who was the organizing?
Julie Graham.
Well, it was Julie Graham, but help me, Julie, I can't think of the title, but folks had, many of the folks, it was the first time they'd been on a reservation. And boy, when we are invited to go to the reservation, show up, because it is excuse me, I'm getting my US and Canada language mixed up. Reserve, yes, Canada. Show up to demonstrations that Indigenous folks are organizing, and start working on having conversations and building relationships. That's one way to approach this work. And another way, I mean, of course, I would love it if you would get a copy of Healing Haunted Histories, and at the end of each chapter are questions that help you dig deeper first into your familial and communal history and story, but in the second part of the book, your own work that can help you move along in this journey of what we would call discipleship of decolonization. Step in.
I just want to come in here too on some of these questions that have been popping up. And last week one of the questions said, what do we mean by decolonization? And I went immediately to decolonizing myself. I went immediately to a shift that I had to make in my own mind. And I think I said it wasn't easy. And it wasn't, but I had to make that shift, and I had to accept certain things that I was not prepared, 10 years ago to accept that I practiced. And a really large one of those has just been named by Tony in the chat in response to the question about how Indigenous people might treat farmland. Assuming that they might treat it like farmland is another way of expressing white supremacy, and being afraid of the change, being afraid of land back, being afraid of Black majority rule after apartheid, these are acts of white supremacy. Having these fears, holding these fears. I'm speaking personally here. And I don't mind if it makes you uncomfortable, because that's kind of the part of the objective is to make people uncomfortable so that we think differently. Putting those fears out there in the public discourse, we don't realize we're doing it, but it's a great act of privilege to do that. It gets back to some of what Ched and Elaine were talking about, that willful, I'm not going to look at this, I'm not going to acknowledge my role in it. Well, I'm willfully going to put out this fear here that if I really sat down and thought it through, if I really got into dialogue, then I would see that it's not such a terrible thing, or a frightening thing. I should say frightening, because I think a lot of this comes out of fear. So I think a huge part of decolonizing, a huge part of reconciliation, a huge part of reparation or reparative justice, of a reparative theology, is dismantling white privilege and naming and dismantling white privilege and white supremacy. And that's painful work for white people, and it's hard work. And I speak from experience on that one. So we need to keep that. And I'm not saying I'm perfect, because I'm not. I still have a lot of privilege in me that comes out, and I don't even know it's coming out. But we have to work at that. A little hot under the collar there.
Oh, one of the themes I'm seeing in the chat here is a sense that tonight you're preaching to the choir. That the people online
I don't think that at all.
Well, let me finish rephrasing the question, because I'd like to throw this over to Elaine and Ched. People who have come, I think, have come because they already care about these issues. But there are some folks saying, how do I talk to people who don't care about these issues? I'm a leader in a church. My congregation doesn't even want to listen. Where do I start? How do I help people understand this is important? I mean, I'm on the journey myself, but I'm supposed to be leading a group of people who are 40 steps behind me. So what do you recommend?
I think often underestimate the power of attraction. it's not about who's ahead and who's behind. It's about how we can ourselves keep stepping more deeply and joyfully into this work. We just want to keep emphasizing over and over that this work is about justice and it's about equity, but it's also about healing, particularly healing for those of us who are tied up in the knots in the disease that Dr. King talked about of white supremacy. We need healing, and as in direct proportion to the relationships we build with our Indigenous neighbors and colleagues, in direct proportion to the ways in which we do brave and compassionate investigation of our own family and communal and institutional histories, in direct proportion to how we venture out into spaces that we do not control, we will experience healing and liberation ourselves. And that will have a power of attraction. We do get into the piety of the shoulds and the oughts. And what I think we're trying to do is invite each other into freedom, and to do that by example, by experimentation. We don't need a majority to do this work, but we can start it and have this robust conversation. We've got so many experiences of individuals who worked with Elaine on the study process of this book, who've just made incredible strides and are just feeling like their life is opening up, and they're so joyful about it. Yes, it's hard, but it's also something that they're becoming evangelistic about in the very best sense.
Well, and what has happened is, as folks are discovering their their ancestral history, and I'm thinking particularly of a couple of folks in the Southeast where their ancestors held, owned, enslaved people. And so the pulling back of those layers has been so painful and so fearful to name out loud and to start telling this story. But what has happened is that as folks have become more courageous in naming their ancestral responsibility and how that has impacted their wealth and their privilege and power, now descendants of enslaved people have come forward to engage them in conversation, and ways have been made clear about what the next step is in a healing journey in partnership with both, again, in the Southeast, African American and Indigenous folk. This is a story coming out of Lumbee territory, and it is so powerful. And so what I'm thinking in this moment is, an elder of ours, wise elder, we are given, oftentimes we are given just enough light to go on, and to be courageous to take that next step, and then more will be, revealed. And what it has been is more relationship has been built, and more layers have been pulled back, and they have brought people along in their family and in their congregation, because the work they are doing is so infectious, but so deep, steeped in their understanding of discipleship. And so if you are alone on this journey in your family, we talk about it in the book, it feels like doing surgery on living flesh. If you're alone in your family, if you're alone in your congregation, keep trying to take those steps forward, because it will be met with people that want to do that journey with you.
Thank you for that. So there's an important debate going on in the chat, and I'm not going to summarize the whole thing for you, but let me put my spin on it and throw it at you. I'd love to hear your response to that. I think one of the blockages among white people to taking reparations seriously is that we come to believe, or we have come to believe, that if we give land or things back to Indigenous people, they'll do stuff with it that we don't like, or that isn't respectable, or isn't appropriate. And we hear stories in the press about that. The one person in the chat mentioned a casino, but that's an example. Should it matter what they do with it? It's theirs.
No,
Or how do you respond to that? I mean, Sarah, let Elaine and Ched respond.
No, my job is animation.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Reconciliation, and
Okay.
this is and I will let Ched and Elaine speak.
Sure.
But this is a huge problem that we have in Canadian society as a whole, and in the church as a microcosm of settler and newcomer Canadian. Are they going to take care of things as well as we did? Are they going to do things with the values we have? They are going to take care of the land. They are going to have economic development. They are going to have the life that they deserve on that land, but they get to set those terms. And we can't allow our fear and our, I'm going to use the words again, privilege and superiority to try and halt the project of reconciliation or reparation. I remember when I first started animating the UN Declaration in the church, I was telling people about it, and someone said to me, so this gives Indigenous people the right to their own spirituality. It gives them it codifies the right to their spirituality. It codifies their right to lands and resources. They said, that makes life better for them. Why wouldn't we be in support of that? And it wasn't a terribly sophisticated analysis, but it actually got to the heart of the matter. And you have to, I think, if you're going to approach this in a principled way, in a way that is not, in a way that explicitly and actively rejects racism, which is what we said we want to do as a church, then we don't give room to those questions anymore. That's my take on it.
And I do think, Sarah, you named it, but what white supremacy is getting in the way of our thinking when we want to, or when we're critical of how the land isn't used in the way that we think it should be used in. That is something we really need to look at and turn over and realize that is about us. It is not about the Indigenous folks, communities that are using this land in a way that is giving life and how they want to use it. And so that is just a piece that when that temptation rises up in it, actually, we can look at it as a gift. It is a gift for us to do our work around the white supremacy that it is so embedded in us, around us, surrounding all of us. So what is our work to do around that when it bubbles up in us?
Yeah, right. We're one of the greatest paralyzing hauntings for we descendants of settler colonialism are the voices in our head. And we are often constrained and captive to those voices, those fears, those assumptions. Part of our liberation is coming into a new conversation, preferably a conversation directly with Indigenous friends and colleagues about different possibilities. Patty said something interesting in the chat, she said, gee whiz, have we done that great of a job caretaking the land when our way of life is now in historic crisis because of our addiction to fossil fuels and climate crisis. We have brought a way of life to this land that in 200 years has brought us to the brink of disaster, and in so doing displaced cultures that had been living sustainably on the land for millennia. So part of that in wrangling the voices in our head is to say, well, first of all, let's more critically examine a lot of the deep assumptions and entitlements that we have, which turn into to immediate judgments of what other people might do. And then let's go forward in a posture of listening and learning. And again, our experience suggests that we have a great deal to learn from folks who are really trying to recover wisdom and recover agency and capacity. And are they going to make mistakes from their own best lights? Of course, they're human and just like we are, but there's so much that we have to learn. And what we want to do is try to figure out how to support that. And when we only listen to fear-based narratives coming out of white culture about what might happen with other communities, we will simply be captive to that spiral. So again, it is a challenge to step outside our comfort zone and to continue to examine ourselves and our history, even as we open our spirits. And I do want to make a plug here that from the great wisdom spiritual traditions of Christianity, this sense of emptying ourselves and opening ourselves is deeply rooted. And this is not just a strategy for decolonization. This is a strategy for the church and for finding renewal in our church and renewing in our own spirits. This is not a formula for the death of our tradition, but the renewal of our tradition. And I believe that Indigenous friends, Christian and non-Christian, will have a lot to teach us about how we can be involved in a recovery project ourselves, because we have mortgaged the gospel in our blind loyalty to a way of life that is in fact not sustainable. There are people in our churches who are waiting to hear that. There are people who haven't yet set foot in our churches because we haven't been talking about that yet. This is a strategy for the future of our church, not for the demise of our churches, but it will be different. And that's why we're so excited that there are well over 100 people who are all asking questions to do this work. So this is a great.
It is wonderful.
Speaking of Indigenous friends, Christian and not, I would like to give the last word on this to our friend and colleague, Tony Snow, who's been with us all evening, but has not been on camera. And I think he can probably send us out of this difficult, heated, but rich conversation into the more mundane conversation that I have to have with you about how to do your family history and how to post a comment into the chat board. So Steve, could you unmute Tony?
I've got, yeah, I'm unmuted here.
Okay.
Thank you for that, Sarah. I think that it's a really interesting conversation, and I'm very thankful for that forward-looking gaze from Ched that really sort of repurpose us back into this space and why we are doing what we're doing. When I think of that response around the stewardship and the idea of the primitiveness of Indigenous people who may not be able to handle their own stewardship kind of idea, and looking at the rich context of that, and thinking about how in sort of the settler neuroses around that is it partially around the idea of ill-gotten gains, land swindles, questionable practices, how people came to be in ownership of certain things and ideas. And we can see that response is sort of mired in guilt and coveting of a particular cultural position or supremacy around that. And so looking at how we are formulating an argument into how we sort of are best suited to maintain the status quo. When I think about that, I think about parts of our history where land acquisitions have been important barriers. So I think about the town of Banff. The town of Banff is located in a very sacred area with a lot of healing waters, mystical and creation story areas, places of worship, places of vision quest, and of connecting with the spirit, spaces of medicines and things like that. And so my father, who was the first Indigenous United Church minister in Alberta, and I followed in his footsteps into ministry, would talk about the Christ in the temple overturning the tables of the money changers and saying that you have turned my place of worship into a den of thieves. And so this idea of a restorative move to reclaim that idea or that practice that was imbued in those spaces, that understanding of deep connection to land that goes back millennia. So we're talking about land back in sort of this idea of fear-based mongering that is sort of let's set everything to rights. The other idea around this is the idea of the restorative justice and reconciliation that we work toward, and what we have agreed to in the foundation of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, the adoption of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, and using those to reassess the effects and our impacts as we move through a new form of relationship building, a new form of relationship, one that takes consideration of past histories, past wrongs, and tries to assess those in a way that will allow us to live in a new balance, a new peace that will help foster better relationships for the future, that will resolve some of the gross inequity and kind of move us into a space of learning from each other and growing into I think, a more rational and real relationship that we can share as a tool, as a foundation into our changing demographic as a country, changing demographic as our communities, and learning to accept and work with one another. And so there's hope within this and that's exactly where Ched was taking this, is that we are on a path in the United Church with not just with our anti-racism declaration, but in the work that we've done in Indigenous reconciliation, in the work that we've done with our affirming stance. And so all of these things come together to try to form us into a better society, a better way of being. I just wanted to add that, and thank you, Sarah, for this time.
Thank you, Tony. I knew that you would bring us to where we need to be to move on. And a reminder that we, for better or worse, have this session recorded, and we can all go back and watch it when Steve gets it up on the website tomorrow. Now, I want to say a big thank you to Elaine and Ched for leading us through their work so efficiently. I spent a week with them going through this book 3 years ago, and they did it today in 45 minutes. So they deserve a big thank you for that. I want to show, I want to show you where we're going next, because the next part is for you to take a look at family history, and as Ched was stressing last week, in particular, geography as well. And I'm going to share my screen. Sorry about that. What this is the ChurchX page for, someone say out loud to me if they can see this, please.
Yes, you can see it now.
Thank you, Steve. So module 3 is the next month, basically. We're not going to meet again until the 29th of May, when we're going to talk about what we've learned about ourselves. We invite you to spend the next 4 weeks exploring your own history at your own pace, using the following guiding questions. And I'm not going to go through them in detail here. I'm just going to go through the bolded parts. Pick an ancestral line that you can trace, something you know about. For me, it was my maternal grandmother. Follow that back as far as you can. If you're worried about how you can do that, talk to other members of your family, try and remember stories you were told when you were younger, take a look at ancestry websites, read the general history of the area you're from. I read lectures in the history of the Newfoundland fishery. by Keith Matthews. So there's all kinds of things like that you can do that will help you. So find the line you can trace, find out as much as you can about where they came from, and why they left. And there are a number of questions there you can see that help guide you through that. Where did they land? And where did they settle? Sometimes those are two different things. Did they move from their landing place? How many times? Some of those kinds of questions that were in the poll. Who were the indigenous people where your people settled? And then what was the relationship there? What can you tease out of that? Now we're getting close to you. Where are you? How does that relate to where your people settled? Why did you move? And so, and what other peoples have been affected by your peoples and your own movement? Because moving from place to place to place, we know that things happen that we may not even be aware of. So this is an opportunity for you to take what you know and explore more. And then we are inviting you to post it in our family history chat or forum. And you can see this link, add your personal stories here. I'm going to click on it. And what I'm going to do now is post mine in. And mine is actually quite developed. And that's because we published it a couple of years ago in the last issue of Mandate magazine. So I don't want you to think I can't get it anything like what Sarah's got hers. Remember that Sarah worked on it for about 2 years, and then she also had a professional editor go over it. So add your personal source, add a discussion topic. See, it's very easy. I'm going to say Sarah's family history. Actually, I'm going to call it Sarah's settler family history. I happen to have it cut and pasted, so I'm just going to copy that in. You can see it copied in quite nicely. It tells the entire story of my family in a page and a half. Yours doesn't have to be that long. And then I'm going to post it to the forum. And it's going to take about 30 minutes to be finalized. I can still go back and edit it if I want to, and you're all going to get it in your email, in your mailbox in about 30 minutes. So you can do this too. You see how easy it was. And it doesn't have to be a complete story. It can be, this week I'm doing this and I got stuck. This week I found out this thing that I never knew happened. I'm so frustrated, I can't do anything. All of these are valid. All of these are valid entries. And Adele and I are going to watch the chat. And when we need to, we're going to come in and help you out. And if you can even put a heading in, Sarah, please help me. And I will do my best until I go on vacation May 11th. I'll be out of range for a while. But it's pretty easy to use, I think. But if there are any questions, and Steve is also here as technical support. But this is a way that we can track each other in the next month. Oh, I wonder what Carolyn is finding out. I wonder what Wendy or Vic are finding out. And we can put that stuff in the chat and we can go back and forth. And then when we reconvene on the 29th, I think what we'll probably do is we'll have digested what you have, and we'll try and come up with some discussion topics for us to talk about on the 29th. So I hope that sounds reasonable. I hope that sounds doable and not too frightening. And even if you confront stuff that you don't want to confront, just go with it. Trust me, just go with it. It's not as scary as you think it is. So,
So Sarah, often when we're inviting people to write to a forum, we say a word or two about confidentiality. Do you want to kind of riff on that theme just for a second?
Yeah, and if I miss anything that we would normally say, please say it. Let's treat this as we're all in a room together and we're sharing information in this room together, but we're not going to go out and explicitly talk about, I'm in this study group and boy, this person from Alberta said this and I can't believe it. We're not going to do that. This is for our own mutual learning and building up. And who knows what might come out of it. It won't be a mandate article because mandate doesn't exist, but it might be a Broadview article. Might be Healing Haunted Histories, the Canadian edition, or the other Canadian edition. So there's all kinds of stuff, but please do respect your peers' confidentiality. And you're not going to get graded on this. The historian is not going to weigh in and grade you. The theologians are not going to weigh in and grade you. So it's a fun exercise. I can tell you that from experience. So this is the time when I would normally say, any questions, students? But I can't do that right now. So, but if you do have questions, put them in that forum, or better yet, email me, sstratton@united-church.ca, and I'll get back to you. A nice message from Elaine and Ched, wishing us well in the work. They've led a lot of people in this work, and I'm pleased they're on this journey with us. So we're 8:56 by my own clock. Are we to read the book at the same time? I think you can read the book on your own time. It might help you to read some of it, but you can also dip in and out. You know, you can pick sort of methodological chapters and things like that. So thanks to everybody who participated in the chat and by listening and remaining so attentive. Thanks to Steve for his technical support, to Adele and Tony for being there off camera tonight, but they've been here with us the whole time. Sarah, please put your email in the chat. Yes, good idea, Beatrice. Basically, the rubric at the United Churches is our first initial and our last name at united-church.ca.
You can also message each other from right within ChurchX if
Oh,
you're all registered in the course. So just hit the participants button at the top of the screen and you can send a message through ChurchX. So if you've lost that email from Sarah, you can always reach her that way.
So I think it's time to send us out, and you know who I'm reading. I should try and get this on discount at the UCRD for everybody who's in this course. So this is to send us off into the evening, whether it's early evening or late evening, wherever you are, and I hope you take it with. Hope you take it with you in your heart tonight, and sleep well after some challenging conversations and some challenging work ahead. Remember that Creator is the wind on my face, the rain in my hair, the sun that warms me. Creator is the trees, rocks, grasses, majesty of the sky, and the intense mystery of the universe. Creator is the infant who giggles at me in the grocery line, the begging person who reminds me how rich I really am, the idea that fires my most brilliant moment, the feeling that fuels my most loving act, and the part of me that yearns for that feeling again and again. Whatever ceremony, ritual, meditation, song, thought, or action it takes to reconnect to that feeling is what I need to do tonight. Remember. Thank you, friends. Sleep well. We'll see you in a month.